Justice.
Justice.
Community.
Accountability.
Freedom.
Repair.
Liberation. Unlocking change.
Unlocking change.
Unlocking change. Unlocking change.
Accountability. Community.
Accountability.
Repair, liberation.
Unlocking
change.
Unlocking change.
Unlocking change.
Unlocking change.
Unlocking change.
Unlocking change.
This is Colorado Radio for Justice, and this is Unlocking Change. I'm your host, JoyBelle Phelan.
And I'm your co-host, Michael Clifton.
Today, we sit down with Kristen Nelson, the Executive Director of Spero Justice Center. She shares her journey starting out battling to end the death penalty, to her realization that the fight for a humane criminal legal system is so much more than just a fight against capital punishment.
There's this really unfortunate, strange shift in dynamics whenever the prosecution declares that they're seeking the death penalty in a case, which is that the goal in the case all of a sudden becomes to avoid the death penalty at all costs. And what that does is it reframes a life sentence as a victory. I came to appreciate that if we're not talking about other extreme sentences in the same breath that we're talking about the death penalty, we're not really going to get anywhere.
It's a conversation about hope, possibility, and humanity with Kristen Nelson from the Spero Justice Center.
That's right now on Unlocking Change.
Welcome to Colorado Radio for Justice. I'm your host, JoyBelle Phelan.
And I am Michael Clifton, the co-host.
Today we are joined by Kristen Nelson with the Spero Justice Center. So let's get started. Welcome, Kristen.
Thank you for having me.
Kristen, is there anything you would like to share or as far as introducing yourself that JoyBelle might not have covered?
Well, I can start by telling you a little bit about Spero's mission and our work in Colorado. That might be a good place to begin.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So Spero Justice Center's mission is to end mass incarceration in Colorado. And we do that by focusing on long sentences, which we know are one of the key drivers of mass incarceration. So if I were to kind of distill down into a single sentence what Spero does, we try to get people out of prison who don't need to be there anymore. So we represent individual incarcerated people in the Colorado DOC in post-conviction, clemency, and parole proceedings. We also look for opportunities to litigate legal issues that could impact larger groups of people who are serving extreme sentences in prison. And finally, we also engage in legislative advocacy and policy work to try to encourage decarcerative policy measures from passing. In other words, measures that or laws that reduce Colorado's prison population.
And so when was Spero formed?
That's a little bit of a complicated question.
Oh, well, okay.
Because Spero evolved out of another grant-funded project that I was directing at the time that did national capital trial consulting work on death penalty cases in a number of jurisdictions around the United States. And basically what ended up happening was through my work on death penalty cases over time, I came to be concerned with, or equally concerned with, life sentences, and came to feel that life sentences were simply another form of the death penalty. And I started to see a real need in Colorado for an organization that was focused on the back end of criminal cases, long after people have gone through their trials and their first stages of appeal. And there wasn't such an organization that existed in Colorado at the time. And so I ended up getting a small amount of funding to pilot the successive sentencing project in Colorado around, it was around the end of 2020, early 2021. And that's what eventually became Spero.
Okay.
We officially launched as Spero Justice Center in the fall of 2022. That actually might be just the simplest way to say it.
But the story is great.
It evolved. Yeah, there's more to it than that, but it evolved out of some capital work that I was doing.
For those of you, I'm sure a lot of us know who Kristen Nelson is, but for those of us who don't, can you kind of talk about like how you got into this work, a little bit about your background?
So I graduated from law school in 2004. And at the point that I graduated from law school, I knew that I wanted to do criminal defense work. And I can explain how that came to be. But just the kind of basic bio or resume is I graduated from law school. I spent a year working for a federal judge in Montgomery, Alabama. Then went to Washington, D.C. and spent 2 years as a trial attorney at the Public Defender Service in D.C. I had met my husband the year that I was clerking in Alabama. He was also a lawyer working for the Southern Poverty Law Center. And so when we decided to get married, I moved back to Alabama and spent 4 years working at the Equal Justice Initiative, primarily representing people on Alabama's death row. And then in 2011, we moved to Colorado to be close to my family who moved here. And I spent almost 7 years working at the Colorado State Public Defender's Office, working in the complex litigation unit, which was sort of the special unit in the Public Defender's Office that was dedicated to working on pretrial death penalty cases. So spent 7 years there, litigated a couple of capital trials, and then left the Public Defender's Office in 2018 and took over this small kind of unicorn of a grant-funded capital trial consulting project. And it was at that point, a couple years into that endeavor, that the idea of starting Spero kind of took form in my heart.
Yeah, your heart, your mind. Yes.
Yeah. But one of the things that many people don't know about how I became interested in this work is my first foray into the criminal legal system was I interned at a prosecutor's office when I was in college.
In Alabama?
No, I'm sorry, in California.
Okay,
I'm from California. I'm from the Bay Area originally. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. And it was completely random. I was set to be a camp counselor at a summer camp that went bankrupt at the last minute, and I found myself at home with no summer job. And my friend's mom was like the supervising file clerk at the Santa Clara County DA's office, and one of their clerks was out on extended medical leave, and they needed somebody to fill in. And so I spent a summer pushing paper around in the misdemeanor unit of the clerk's office of the Santa Clara County DA's office. And I thought it was amazing. I made $11 an hour, and that was, big money back then. Yeah. And so I went back for a second summer and I worked in the juvenile division. And it was that summer when I was working in the juvenile division, I was, like I said, pushing paper around on a desk all day, reading these police reports. And I kept thinking to myself, I just had this really intense curiosity, like, how do these kids find themselves in these situations? Like, what brought them to this point where they're getting arrested by the police for, this, that, or the other? And I know there's more to the story than what I'm reading in this police report, and I'm really curious about what that is. And there was a DA who would handle like kind of what they called the in custodies, right? The kids who were arrested and kept in custody, and those had to be processed on an expedited basis. And so every afternoon, I would kind of trudge over, from the DA's office to like the little office that was like in the detention facility to deliver paperwork to the DA on duty. And I would have to walk by the juvenile detention facility every day. And I remember seeing, kind of like feet, like there was just enough kind of space, in the building to see like feet going, up and down these stairs. And I just remember just like looking at that building with such curiosity, like what's going on inside of there? And like, what are people experiencing and, who are they? I had really no exposure to anything like that. Yeah. So I studied abroad in England my junior year of college, and I got a hold of this like giant fat internship book and was just flipping through looking for something to do the summer after my junior year. And I came across an internship with the Public Defender Service in DC. They have this really fantastic internship for undergraduate students where they basically take you and they make you an investigator, and they like kind of just throw you on cases with a lawyer, and you go out and you traipse around DC and you interview witnesses and you meet with clients at the jail, and you basically do all the things that like a staff investigator does. And I was like, oh, that's what I want to, this is going to give me the opportunity to see what it's like to be, kind of on the other side. To this day, I believe that they made an error offering me this internship. The criminal defense community, can be quite judgmental about people who have experience in prosecutor offices, right? And they didn't interview me. I was, studying abroad in England. Like, I just got a letter saying, congratulations, you've gotten this internship. And I was surprised and excited. And so I went to DC the summer in between my junior and senior year of college. And that was the summer that everything just kind of clicked for me. Like, I met incarcerated people for the first time. And I, was exposed to, just all of the complex social forces that, cause people to, find themselves enmeshed in the criminal legal system. And I could tell right away, like, oh, this is where I belong. Like, this is the side where I belong. And then, my first summer in law school, I worked for the Southern Center for Human Rights, which is a death penalty organization in Atlanta. All of the interns were assigned to work on an Alabama death penalty case. There's a real crisis in representation going on. It still is. Yeah. And I was working with this lawyer named Chris Adams, who had been a trial attorney in South Carolina before he went to the Southern Center. And, the first time we went to go meet our client on death row, it was like this 4-hour drive from Atlanta to Atmore, Alabama. And I was just so eager and hungry and curious to, like, learn from other lawyers, like, how did you know this was, what you were meant to do? And I will never forget this conversation with Chris and what he said. He had this kind of Southern drawl and this very charismatic, kind of trial lawyer personality. And he was like, and here I am, like, standing next to my client, and he is down on his luck, and everybody's mad at him. His wife is mad at him, and the DA is mad at him, and the judge is mad at him. And he's having, he is at the lowest point in his life. And I'm the person who gets to stand next to him and say something good about him. How life affirming is that? And I still remember that conversation as, like, the moment that it all clicked for me. I'm like, that's what appeals to me about this work. That's totally it. That's so true. Like, I get to see the good in people.
I just want to say a quick shout out to the summer camp. Just a quick
Thank you for dissolving.
but thankfully you were able to pivot from that and to find what you're really passionate about, because working in, capital punishment, that type of work, I'm sure you have to have resilience, but you also have to be compassionate. How long did you work on those type of cases? And can you kind of talk about the impact that it has on you?
I spent the better part of 2 decades working on death penalty cases, both at the appellate stage in Alabama, where people had already been tried and convicted and sentenced to death. And I was meeting them, kind of during the first stage of the appeals process. And then when I was here in Colorado for almost 7 years, representing people facing the death penalty. Those were 2 very different experiences. Each of them was difficult in their own way. But I took so much from my time working on capital cases. There's this really unfortunate, strange, like, shift in dynamics whenever the prosecution declares that they're seeking the death penalty in a case, which is that the goal in the case all of a sudden becomes to avoid the death penalty at all costs. And what that does is it reframes a life sentence as a victory. And I had this really poignant series of experiences with my clients where I came to appreciate very deeply that life sentences were not victories for my clients in the same way that they were sort of celebrated in the capital defense community as victories for lawyers. One of my first clients that I represented in Alabama, whose death sentence was overturned and was resentenced to life without parole, told me years later that after he was resentenced to life, he wanted to go back to death row. Not because he wanted to die, but because all of the lawyers and all of the resources and all of the attention go to people who are on death row, and nobody cares about you anymore once you're serving a life sentence. I had another client of mine from EJI give up his appeals and choose to be executed after a couple years after I left EJI when I was already here in Colorado. Because he knew that best case scenario, even if we won his appeal, he would be sentenced to life in prison. And that was not a sentence that he thought he could survive or wanted to serve. And so he chose to be executed instead. And I had a client who pled guilty and accept a life without parole sentence in exchange for avoiding the death penalty tell me years later that he regretted his decision to plead, not because he thought he would do any better at trial, not because he wasn't guilty, not because he wasn't remorseful or accountable or any of those things, but simply because he didn't realize how important hope was until he didn't have it anymore. And it was experiences like that that just kind of settled into my heart, for lack of a better way of putting it, and caused me to really think about what I was doing with my career. Like, I'm still very proud of the work that I did on capital cases all of those years. I believe very strongly that death penalty abolition is important, but I came to appreciate that if we're not talking about other extreme sentences in the same breath that we're talking about the death penalty, we're not really going to get anywhere. One of the other moments in time when I really had this shift in my thinking was I was listening to testimony at the legislature in support of a bill to abolish capital punishment. It was actually the year before we achieved death penalty abolition. So it was in 2019. And I was live streaming the testimony. I was listening to it on my computer. And there was a lawyer from my community who was, testifying in favor of death penalty abolition and was talking about, how his clients, deserve the deepest, darkest circles of hell, and describing, a client of his who had been sent out of state and was going to be locked in a cage for 23 hours a day, and that he was never going to progress out of that circumstance. And kind of the concluding kind of argument was, we don't need the death penalty to keep people safe. We have life without parole. And it's this, great alternative to the death penalty. So we don't need the death penalty. And that was a moment where I kind of just sat up in my chair and I thought, I don't know if I can be a part of this anymore. If these are the arguments that we feel that we have to adopt, to get rid of the death penalty, we're just going to be legitimizing life without parole.
Yeah, in a sense, you're affirming that life without parole. And you mentioned it, like you came to that revelation, but life without parole is a death sentence. It's just a slow death sentence, right? And that can be really excruciating. And you talked about how important that hope is. That was really key for me, in my sense, and also me trying to get people to understand how important hope is, because it's not this tangible thing, right? And a lot of people are like, what is it? What is it? But if you don't have that hope, it affects everything from your the thing you do when you think about whatever you do when you get up that day, your aspirations, right? So yeah, that's so key, and I'm glad you came to that revelation.
Well, and it makes me think about, like, I didn't serve as much time as you did, and I didn't have that sentence. But since I've been out of prison, I go back a lot, and I've met a lot of guys who had their death, overturned, and like a lot of men who have, definitely more men. I only know of 2 women, and like, I know these people as human beings. These are people I care about. And like, if you read about their story on the news, they're horrible people, but they're also funny and articulate and kind and caring. And, they're good. Yeah, we all did horrible things to go to prison. And there's more to us than that. And just hearing you say about this guy giving that testimony, it just makes my heart hurt, because I know these people. Some of these people who are impacted by that are people I would call my friends, people that I would welcome into my home, people that, like, yeah, they screwed up, but so did we.
Yeah.
And it just really makes me, for me at least, really makes you think that they don't actually know the people behind that sentence.
Yeah. Well, and I think in that, I agree. And in that instance, what I really felt was, I don't think he believes what he's saying either, but this is the narrative he feels that he has to adopt.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a problem too.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
That's a big problem. The way that we think about, talk about, conceive of, criminal legal policy in this country, the way that second chances can be weaponized against politicians who give them, right? Is really a huge problem.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's interesting to think about. I've grappled with this question for a long time, ever since listening to that testimony. Like, is that what he really thought, or is that what he felt like he had to say?
Right.
Either of those things is problematic,
right?
Yeah. And to your point, Michael, about the hope, I totally agree. Spero is the Latin word for hope. That's why we chose the name that we chose for our organization. I spent a long time kind of grappling with this idea of hope. Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Is it a necessary thing? Is it just kind of this drug that sometimes like people kind of live in a state of, kind of not accepting reality by
all of the above,
right? But I finally kind of came to accept and believe that it really is an essential part of being human and an essential part of motivating people to keep going. Yeah.
It keeps us going. Yeah. And like I said, it was so important for me, and I feel like I tried to argue it so much, but like I said, it's not tangible. So it's like people don't really grasp it until I think maybe you're in a position where you actually lose that hope, and then you realize how meaningful and how important it is.
Yeah.
I was 19, committed 2 aggravated robberies, went to trial, was eventually sentenced to 98 years in prison, and that. Going to prison at 21 with basically a life sentence, right? De facto life sentences, right? Yeah, I was hopeless. And then there's, we have that small hope of appeals, right? Your case being overturned, but that is very slim, right? And it does happen, but it's slim. So, it actually affected my everyday choices for the first 12 to 13, 14 years, right? And I, spiraled into a deeper negative hole. But, for whatever fate or whatever, there was like things that intervened to where I like hit rock bottom. And I was able to kind of grasp onto it just because I also felt that I, like deep in my heart, like my sentence was so unjust that I think it was still alive in there, right? It was still like a spark of hope that when I eventually did hit rock bottom, I was able to tap back into it, right? But some people completely lose it and aren't able to tap back it, get to that hope. So I think that is very important, it's very meaningful, and I think that's the other part of like believing in the redemptive value in people, right? Like, we've all made mistakes, some worse than others, and then not just mistakes, but bad decisions. But I feel like it's innate in us as human beings that we have redemptive value, whatever bad decision or mistake that we made. So
100%. And actually, you just touched on something else that I spent a lot of time thinking about when I was thinking about starting Spero, and what I wanted to do beyond just fight against the death penalty, which is kind of reimagining like what legal advocacy can look like. I was very much inspired. I've always been a person who's really enjoyed spending time with clients. It's one of the big motivating pieces of the work for me. And through staying in touch with clients and kind of tracking their progress and growth and change, like after they've been sentenced, I was incredibly inspired, right? Like, here you are serving this sentence without the possibility of release, and you've still, in the midst of struggling to survive, living in an inherently traumatic environment, not being, not having your intellect, your soul, your life nurtured and enriched in all of the ways that, might be optimal, right? Not only are you surviving that sentence, but you're inspired to grow and change and positively impact your community. Like, that's incredible. And what if we had a legal system that valued that?
Once again, I'm JoyBelle Phelan.
And I'm your co-host, Michael Clifton.
This conversation with Kristen Nelson will continue in our next episode of Unlocking Change, where we'll dive into ways that the criminal legal system is, and isn't, currently working, and how Kristen aspires to even bigger systemic changes that really center the humanity of incarcerated people and their communities.
That's coming up on the next episode of Unlocking Change. Unlocking Change is a production of Colorado Radio for Justice. Catch a fresh episode of Unlocking Change every first Friday of the month on our airwaves. And find it on demand on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts.